me a second to open the door. Stand back, please. Ash and his friends did as they were told and took a few steps back just as the large doors slowly parted and allowed them entry. Together, they entered the lighthouse and found themselves standing in darkness just as the two separate doors smoothly came back as one behind them again. In only a few short moments their surroundings became visible as the lights came on and illuminated what was now seen to be quite the large interior of the lighthouse. The lights themselves, interestingly enough, were not only found high up on the vaulted ceiling but also in the form of electric gas-lit torches, of which were attached to huge pillars spaced evenly throughout the ground level of the building. The floors, they noticed, were made of the same dark blue stone as the walls, pillars and ceiling and, interestingly enough, there seemed to be carvings of Pokémon etched onto much of the stony interior. Much as it was on the door outside. The four of them all walked down the length of the ground floor until they came to an elevated platform with steps leading to the top. However, it was what stood upon the platform that caused the group of young trainers to very nearly jump in fright. Impossibly, it appeared to be a man-sized Kabuto standing upright in the center of the stone platform, staring at them with beady red eyes. Giselle immediately screamed and grabbed hold of Ash, tightly, while Brock and Misty both took a step back in shock. Ash himself merely blinked in disbelief. Suddenly, before anyone could say or do anything, the mysterious prehistoric Pokémon actually spoke. Wait. Please do not be afraid. I'm not really a Pokémon, this is what I was telling you about. The small arms on the apparently faux Kabuto began moving back and forth. This is just a suit, but I'm trapped because the button that opens it cannot be reached by these tiny little arms. Will you please help me? After detaching Giselle from his arm, Ash cautiously walked up to the costumed stranger on top of the platform. With the assistance of whoever was in the suit, he managed to find the small red button that opened it and pressed it. Afterwards he quickly stepped back to rejoin his friends. A moment later, the back of the strange suit gave a loud clicking sound before opening up at the divide between the front and rear parts of the shell. No sooner did this occur and a person quickly emerged from within, stepping out of the still freestanding costume in order to take several large, greedy lungfuls of fresh air. After regaining his composure, the still unknown stranger finally turned to look at his four young visitors. Ash guessed, from sheer appearance, that the man was somewhere around his early to mid-20s. He had green hair and was dressed in a nice red suit with a green scarf tucked into the top of it. The man smiled brightly at the sight of them and then hurried over to greet his rescuers. Oh, thank you so much for getting me out of that dreadful thing. This he said while rapidly shaking Ash's hand, the voice matching the one they had heard over the intercom. Once he was finally done shaking Ash's hand gratefully, the young man stepped back and gestured at himself whilst looking over all of his guests. My name is Bill. Accredited Pokémon researcher, inventor and creator of the Pokémon digital transfer and storage system, as well as one of the many minds responsible for helping to further the Pokédex. At your service. Ash smiled after hearing the rather flamboyant greeting and then gestured at himself as well. Great to meet you, Bill. I'm Ash Ketchum, from Pallet Town, and this here is my buddy Pikachu. He smiled at the Pokémon on his shoulder, who as usual greeted with a cheerful chirp and smile, before his friends introduced themselves in turn. My name's Brock, sir. I'm from Pewter City. I'm Misty, from Cerulean City. And my name is Giselle. I come from Viridian City. Bill smiled kindly at them after they were finished introducing themselves. It is so good to have visitors here. I must admit that I do not get out much since I am usually always busy with either my research, contributing something new to the Pokédex, or seeking other ways to advance the Pokémon storage system. He then placed his hands on his hips. If I may ask, what brings the lot of you all the way out here to my lighthouse? Ash spoke for the collective group. We're heading for Vermilion City. We stopped to have a day on the beach and then decided to come here as it got late on us. We didn't wanna be stuck out on the beach as it got colder tonight. The green-haired man nodded in understanding. Well, you are almost certainly welcome to stay here if you like. I would be overjoyed to have some company. All of them looked at one another, eagerly sharing a nod at the kind offer, before Misty replied. That would be great, Bill, thanks. Anything to keep us off that cold beach tonight. Giselle, at that moment, asked the question they were all curious about. Excuse me, Bill, would it be okay to ask why were you dressed like a Pokémon? The green-haired man smiled at her and replied. It's part of my research. I believe in getting into the minds of the Pokémon you are studying, and the best way to do that is to act like them and sometimes even dress up like them. At that, he scratched his temple and looked a tad awkward. Unfortunately, I often overlook the smallest but most crucial of details in my excitement to make new breakthroughs. Such as forgetting to make sure the arms of that Kabuto costume could reach the release button. Hey. With a sigh, he ran a hand through his hair. Normally that would not be a problem since I have a research assistant who helps me when I make such silly little mistakes. But alas for me, he is on holiday at the present time. At that very moment Ash suddenly smiled and pointed at him. Hey, wait a minute, I think I've actually heard of you before, from Professor Oak. Bill looked at him surprised. Professor Oak, you say, really? The boy nodded in response. Yeah, he actually helped teach and train me before I left on my journey. He's my mentor, but Professor Oak and his family has always been so close to mine. He's more like my granddad in a lot of ways. The Pokémon researcher had his own moment of recognition. Oh yes, now that rings a bell. So you're the young man Professor Oak has always spoken so highly of whenever we've chatted on video calls. Ash once again gave a nod and gestured at himself. I'm training to become a Pokémon master, but I'd really also like to be a professional researcher like you and Professor Oak someday. He even took me on as his apprentice and gave me a journal to write about all the things I experience with Pokémon on my journey. The well-dressed inventor smiled and put a hand on his hip. I'm glad to hear it. There are so many things to learn about Pokémon in this world, and having another researcher on the case is always a great thing. You couldn't have picked anyone better to learn from than Professor Oak either, in my opinion. At that, Giselle spoke up again. So do you live here all the time? Bill shook his head. Most of the time, but not always. Originally I am from Goldenrod City in the Johto region. However, I moved to Fuchsia City with my sister and grandfather when I received an offer to help work on the Pokédex shortly after graduating from technical school. He looked up in fond remembrance. It was there that I first had the idea for the Pokémon storage system. I moved here only a few years ago when I desired to have more peace and quiet to focus on my research. He then looked at Misty. You said you were from Cerulean City, didn't you, Misty? Then you must know of the Cape. I have a small cottage there that I use on occasion when I want to slip away and take a break from this place. The orange-haired girl blinked and then pointed at him. So that small cottage at the top of the Cape, above the restaurant inn, is yours. I've seen it before. He nodded. Indeed. I haven't been there in some time, but when I do go, it is quite a relaxing and enjoyable change of pace for me. Brock took that moment to shift topics slightly by asking. So Bill, since you created the virtual Pokémon storage system and helped to further the Pokédex, how many Pokémon do you think there are? I know it might seem like a bit of a silly question, but I'd like to hear a professional's opinion on the matter. Bill sighed and then sat down on the steps of the raised platform behind him, smiling as he looked around at all the images of Pokémon that were carved into the stony interior of the lighthouse. It's not silly at all, Brock. But unfortunately, the only answer I can give is that we simply do not know. There are so many different kinds of Pokémon, from here in Kanto all the way to regions as distant as Galar, that we can never really set an accurate number. He then stood back up and pulled out a black remote from his suit pocket. Pressing a button on the center, Bill caused a projector that was hanging down from the ceiling overhead to suddenly switch on. It then started to beam an image onto the nearest wall that took up the entire width and height of the stone surface. While Ash and his friends stared in awe at what they were seeing, which was a huge digital diagram of hundreds of Pokémon, Bill gestured up at it in a grand fashion. But if you ask my honest opinion as merely another lover of Pokémon, then I would say the number is really only limited to how big the planet is and where all they are capable of living. And that does not even take into account any Pokémon that might live beyond the reaches of our world. Misty interjected at that point. When we passed through Mt. Moon, we met a scientist who believed that some Pokémon came from space. Bill nodded understandingly. And that's entirely possible. When it comes to Pokémon, there is no such thing as an impossible theory. The mysteries surrounding them will go on and on indefinitely. That is what makes the job as a Pokémon researcher so fun and exciting. If you have a theory, run with it. You never really have any idea just how far it may take you. Everyone nodded in agreement at those insightful words and simply stared at the massive projected image of all the Pokémon on the wall before Ash, remembering something important, spoke up. Hey guys, I just remembered that I need to call Professor Oak and check to see how Krabby is doing. I also need to send Firo back to the lab so I can have an open space on my team again. His friends turned to him while Bill put his hands into his suit pockets. Do you need to use my phone, Ash? It is right over there in the corner if you do. He nodded toward the opposite wall, where there was a video phone on a desk with a Bellsprout receiver. The boy just shook his head though. No thanks, Bill, I have my own way of calling right here. He then lifted up his right wrist to show his X-transceiver and Bill smiled. Even though such devices were indeed long from being released to the general public, he was not necessarily a member of the general public. Very well then, please do give Professor Oak my kindest regards. Leaving his friends to keep chatting with the intelligent inventor and researcher, Ash went over and sat at the desk before lifting his wrist up and opening the call feature of his high-tech field device. After dialing the correct number, he watched the screen buzz with a ring icon before. After about the fourth or fifth one, the screen illuminated and Samuel Oak's face was shown on the other end. Heya, Professor. The older man smiled upon seeing who it was. Ah, Ash boy, good to hear from you. How is everyone? The messy-haired boy answered rather enthusiastically. We're all doing good. We've been traveling a lot and training super hard every day, so I'd say everyone is great. His mentor nodded. Good. Good. Yes, I figured you were keeping busy, and you should know, your Pokémon here with me are doing much the same. Quite honestly, I sometimes have a little trouble getting them to stop long enough to eat. He chuckled in amusement at that before his eyes suddenly became slightly wide. Oh yes, and that reminds me. I first would like to congratulate you on catching so many Pokémon already and also offer my heartiest praise for your latest capture. I must say that I was rather impressed when I saw it. Ash eagerly sat forward in the chair. You got Krabby then, Professor? How is he? With a simple eye smile did his mentor reassure him. Oh, he's absolutely fine, Ash. See for yourself. He then turned the angle of the monitor slightly until Ash found himself looking at his Krabby, whom was inside of a water-filled glass tank. There was also another, far smaller Krabby in the same kind of tank next to him. Ash smiled at his newest Pokémon just before the professor reappeared back in the video's view. See. He's totally fine, my boy. The young man sighed in relief. Good, I'm glad, thanks, Professor. He then asked curiously while gesturing toward the other tank. Who does that other Krabby belong to? The old man sat back down in his seat and began stirring up a bowl of tofu he had just made. That is actually Gary's Krabby. As you can see, his is nowhere near the size of yours, which brings me to a question I had for you, Ash. How did you manage to make such a catch? The black-haired trainer shrugged. I actually caught him in the ocean today when we were having a day at the beach. We're on the way to Vermilion City right now. He then paused for a moment before continuing. Professor, what made Krabby get so big anyway? The older man merely sighed and shook his head. Honestly, Ash, I don't know. I have been wondering that same thing since you sent Krabby here earlier today. It is indeed a puzzle that I am still trying to figure out. He then raised a single hand in a postulating gesture. My only guess would be that maybe Krabby was just born differently from others of his species and it allowed him to grow to such an incredible size. It could be something he was taking into his diet, or it could have been something he was exposed to in the ocean. It really is quite hard to say. The wizened researcher gestured back at the Pokémon in question with the chopsticks he held in his hand. The only thing I do know for certain is that when Krabby evolves, he is going to get even bigger. Perhaps even immensely so. He paused for a moment in thought. This is just a rough estimate, but judging by Krabby's current size and what we know about how much his species grows from their original state into Kingler upon evolution, they usually double or triple in body size when they evolve. Your Krabby, I believe, will grow to be 2 or 3 times the size of a normal Kingler upon evolution. Ash nodded. That'll be interesting to see for sure. I'll be getting Krabby back soon so I can start his training and nutrition plan. I have to go for now though. Our host for tonight is Bill, the Pokémon researcher, so I need to get back to them. The grayish, yellow-haired grandfather appeared surprised to hear that. Bill, you say? Yes, Ash, get back in there. He can really help you along with your own training to become a Pokémon researcher, so learn all you can from him. I'll pass on your regards to your mother next time I see her. Ash smiled. Thanks, Professor. Talk to you later. Oh, and Bill sends his regards. Samuel smiled and gave a wave. Take care, my boy, please give him mine as well. After ending the call, Ash went back over to join his friends and found them still listening to Bill as he spoke about all the many different species of Pokémon there were. Professor Oak wanted me to tell you, hey Bill, the young rookie informed as he joined in on the conversation. The green-haired man turned to him. Yes, thank you, Ash. I was just telling your friends here all about how, as a Pokémon trainer, it is your job to catch as many Pokémon as you can. To train them up and build a strong bond with them, just as it is my job to learn as much about Pokémon as I can as a researcher. Ash nodded. It must be exciting for you, studying all different types of Pokémon and learning so many new things about them. Bill gave a smile in the affirmative. Yes, it is. However, there is only one Pokémon I am searching for right now. One mystery that I am trying to solve. A Pokémon no one has ever seen before, truly one of a kind. A genuine wonder. They all seemed both confused and interested at that statement, but Giselle was the one to ask. What Pokémon is that? The red-dressed man looked up at the digital image still being projected on the wall. I don't know what Pokémon it is. All I know is that it is very special and unique. One I have been trying to find for a few years now. At that, he gestured upward. Come with me to the top of the lighthouse, you'll see what I am talking about there. Soon, they were all following Bill over to a door that opened up into a circular flight until they came to another door. With a click of the remote he held, the projector switched off and the Pokémon species map on the wall disappeared. He then led them up the flight of winding stairs until it came to yet another door, which opened up out on top of the lighthouse. As they stood on the circular, wraparound platform that surrounded the beacon atop the lighthouse, Ash and his friends were in awe at what they saw. While it was nighttime and the fog lay heavy over the ocean, they could still glimpse farther out to sea from the high vantage point. And the slowly rotating light above them also helped to provide a little more illumination to the otherwise slightly eerie setting. Bill went over and stood next to the railing before grabbing hold of it. One night, when I was up here thinking, I heard the strangest but most captivating sounds drifting over the ocean. I listened intently, completely enraptured, for Arceus only knows how long until it finally stopped. From that moment on, I became fixated on whatever creature made those sounds. He fished through his pocket and pulled out yet another small remote. After weeks of painstaking work, I managed to piece together what I thought was the closest comparison to the sound I heard. This was done by blending together many different noises, specifically from other Pokémon. Bill stared out across the dark expanse of water beyond. I then sent this sound back across the ocean from special sonar equipment I attached to the lighthouse beacon. It also causes the light itself to project different colors as a visual form of communication. He then pressed a button on the remote and a sound began coming from the lighthouse that was directed out across the ocean. It was a sound as haunting, yet beautiful, as Bill described, and while it played, the light being given by the beacon started to blink and shift through a series of varying colors. Bill smiled to himself as he listened to his recording play. Since I pieced this sound together by combining the vocalizations of different Pokémon, I was also able to formulate a crude but simple message through this same recording. Essentially it says, "I would love to meet you, can we be friends?" The young man still did not look away from the ocean. Amazingly, a few nights later I actually heard that same sound as before coming back to me. This time I recorded it, and by passing it through the rudimentary copy I made of whatever language this mysterious Pokémon makes, I was able to roughly translate what it said. He then pressed a second button and his recording stopped, only to be replaced by another, similar sounding one. Only this time, there was no doubt that the sound Ash and his friends were hearing now had certainly not been created. It most definitely had to have come from the original source, and the proof was in how the hauntingly melodious sound sent shivers down their spine. Bill gave the translation even as it played. The Pokémon is basically saying, "Yes, I want to meet you too, let's be friends." Ever since then I have played my own recording every single night, hoping to someday maybe even see this elusive Pokémon. Will you try and capture it if you do see it? Misty asked. Bill shook his head. Why would I want to capture it? Meeting it is enough for me. Besides, I'm not a Pokémon trainer. Do you know anything about the Pokémon besides what it sounds like? Brock crossed his arms. The Johto native merely shook his head once more. The only thing I believe I know about this Pokémon is that it is probably one of the biggest in this region, if not the world. And if it is either the last or only one of its kind, it is most likely just looking for someone to care for it. All of them simply stared out across the ocean after that and continued to listen to the melodious recording that the lighthouse was playing. Ash eventually looked over at Giselle though and then smiled before holding his hand out to her. Care to dance? The pretty brunette initially blushed softly at his offer but then gave a small nod, smiling in return as she held her hand out to him acceptingly. Actually, yes, I would, thank you. After tentatively taking the other's hand, the two young trainers slowly came together, at first a tad awkward. However, before long, that initial nervous hesitancy began to fade as the music beckoned their ears and swayed their feet, leading to the both of them falling into a comfortable, smooth rhythm as they swayed and moved in agreeable time to the melody. Brock and Bill were both too distracted by staring out over the ocean to pay much heed to what they were doing, but Misty saw it. She almost immediately felt a slight gnawing of what felt like frustration as she watched Giselle dance so gracefully with Ash. Forcing those feelings down, however, and utterly refusing to accept them, she turned back to the railing, biting the inside of her cheek in an attempt to fully squash those same infuriating emotions that were spinning around in her head. Feelings she most definitely did want to face or consider at the present time. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX before the hill which went up to the large structure in question, stood none other than Jesse, James and Meowth. The criminally incompetent trio who belonged to the nefarious Team Rocket organization. So, Jesse, how do you propose we go about stealing the twerp's Pikachu? James spoke while looking through his binoculars. Being that high up, I don't see how we could get the drop on them. The magenta-haired villain hummed to herself in thought before pulling her eyes away from her binoculars and smirking. I know exactly how we'll do it. Do we still have those stun launchers? Her teammate nodded, pulling from his pocket that same little black cube that could, amazingly, be used to teleport, shrink, grow and store items. Right in here. His own snide smirk matched hers, causing Jessie to look up at the lighthouse again. Then we'll scale up the cliffside and use the stun bombs to startle them. In all the distraction it'll only be too easy to steal Pikachu. Crossing his paws, Meowth quirked an eyebrow at his two human partners. That all sounds great, geniuses, but how ya gonna get Pikachu away in time before they come after us? Jessie's ruby red lips formed into another smirk as she put her hands on her hips and looked down at Meowth. Easy. Those stun rockets also kick up a smoke cloud once they explode. We'll just use that as our cover to escape with Pikachu in tow. James held the cube in his hand up and gave it a quick spin. I'm pretty sure there's also a rubber containment sphere in here that we got from HQ shortly after deciding to go after Pikachu. We can use that to keep it in once we snatch it. The talking Pokémon merely shrugged in vague assent. Guess even numbskulls gotta get a nut every now and again. With their foolish and criminally degenerate plan put into play, the trio of rockets made their way to the cliffside in question. With darkness as their cover, no one atop the lighthouse saw them as they moved silently and swiftly to carry out their half-baked scheme. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX dancing to the hauntingly melodious sounds of the mystery Pokémon. She had her chin resting upon his shoulder before sighing contentedly. Doesn't it feel romantic up here right now? He smiled as they continued to slowly sway. Yeah, it really is. Thanks for sharing a dance with me. Giving a small smile herself, she held to him a little tighter and replied softly, my pleasure. Ash was just about to say something else when, suddenly, they all heard another sound coming from across the ocean. It was a sound that greatly resembled Bill's recording, but this one was most definitely coming from out across the ocean. Ash and Giselle ended their dance quickly and hurried over to stand with Bill, Brock, Misty and Pikachu, who was sitting on the railing. That's the signal. Bill exclaimed in shocked disbelief. The Pokémon I mentioned, I think it's here. Ash and his friends became wide-eyed in similar states of astonishment and tried to peer through the thick fog that was still blanketing the ocean like a screen. After what felt like an endless and agonizing period of waiting with bated breath, they at last saw a dark shape moving through the fog and approaching the lighthouse. Excitement quickly turned to anxiety and even a slight air of fear charged the atmosphere as the unknown slowly neared their position. The shape gradually grew larger and seemed to be rising up out of the ocean as it came. It continued moving in that same slow, unhurried manner, almost as though a specter of the great deep had arisen to make itself known to those of the living. Keening and ominously wailing all the while in response to Bill's recordings. After what seemed like an eternity, the mysterious creature finally came to stand within a relatively short distance of the lighthouse. Still it sang in harmonious reply to the man-made recording, its majestically glowing eyes shining like pure blue sapphires as it followed the perfectly timed blinking of the multicolored lights, of which were still pulsating hypnotically from the lighthouse's beacon. Oh my, was all Bill could say, his breath caught in his throat, eyes wide and his legs frozen in place. Amazing. Misty's own voice trembled, thick with a varying host of emotions that Giselle mimicked perfectly. It's so mysterious, and beautiful too. Ash, for his part, remained completely silent as he took in the wondrous sight before his wavering eyes. While the identity of the creature was still too dark to see, its sheer presence and mass, not to mention the sounds it was making, and the glowing of its eyes, made it seem to be the very picture of majestic mystery. It's massive. Brock openly marveled. How tall would you say it is, Bill? The stunned researcher could only hope to stammer a reply. I have no idea. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX James gaped while he and his comrades hung from the cliff and stared up at the giant enigma. No kidding. Jessie nodded in agreement before a heinous idea suddenly entered her villainous mind. And a Pokémon so rare and unique should also belong to Team Rocket. She gave her teammate a pointed look, James being able to understand her meaning as he shakily nodded. While intimidated at the sight of such a monstrosity, he was more fearful of Jessie's temper and therefore did not question her. Therefore, he made sure his footing was stable on the rocky crag he was standing upon and then pulled their newly unshrunken rocket launcher around into his arms, which he had been carrying strapped to his back. Just as he took aim at the creature, James looked over at his teammates with sorrow in his eyes. You know, I do feel a little bad for attacking something so majestic and unique. Meowth held one of his furry fists up. Yeah, well, stop feeling bad and think about da pay raise we'll get from da boss. Yeah, James, stop being such a wimp. Jessie growled, her tone promising repercussions if he disobeyed. Okay, here we go. The blue-haired man swallowed nervously and looked through the sight lens as he prepared to take his shot at the unaware creature. Once he had a clear shot, the nervous coward finally pulled the trigger. Immediately, a sleek black stun rocket came erupting out of the portable cannon's long barrel and sped toward its colossal target. Just as the mysterious Pokémon began coming closer to the lighthouse, the unseen projectile suddenly struck the creature right in its side, causing it to wail in pain and stumble back a few steps. Due to its sheer enormity, each step caused huge waves to spring up and smash against the cliffside, the deep rapidly becoming unsettled. James, against his better judgment, continued to fire salvo after salvo at the massive Pokémon. Each rocket unfortunately hit its mark, such a target being nearly impossible to miss, and this replaced the creature's singing with a cacophony of repeated cries of distress. The unexpected attack caused the mysterious marine Pokémon to begin thrashing violently, its massive legs raising and falling and the sudden appearance of a huge tail adding to the chaos as the ocean turned into a disaster zone. Gigantic waves were created by the creature's distemper that viciously pounded against the jagged cliff that the lighthouse resided upon. As the monolithic Pokémon neared the lighthouse due its uncontrolled thrashing and violent upheaval, everyone standing atop the platform just under the beacon could only stare in aghast. A mixture of shock and even fear replacing their earlier excitement and joy. I don't understand, what happened? Giselle yelled as she held tight to the railing, eyeing the distressed creature wearily as it came closer and closer. I don't know. Bill shook his head, helpless to do anything more than watch the scene of chaos unfold. I believe something has hurt and angered it. Watch out. Ash shouted just as the rampant Pokémon swung a huge arm around and struck the top of the lighthouse, smashing and destroying the beacon above as if it were a mere pebble. We need to get down from here. Bill called out over the sound of falling debris and the deafening roar of wildly crashing waves. They all quickly made haste and followed Bill as he led them to a set of steps that went down from the platform, skirted around the side of the lighthouse and ended at the ground. As they ran with all expediency, the enraged and assaulted Pokémon again swung its arm and this time completely took off the top half of the lighthouse. This caused them to run even faster, taking the steps two at a time while holding their arms above their head to provide some form of protection against the large chunks of falling concrete and metal now raining down upon them. Ash and Giselle were the last to make it to safety, but just as the latter reached the final step, a large chunk of the upper platform itself fell down toward her. Acting fast, Ash put on a burst of speed and shoved Giselle from behind, wrapping his arms around her and leaping forward just as the massive hunk of concrete smashed into the bottom set of steps, utterly destroying it. You okay? He looked over at her as they both lay on the ground for just a moment, his arms still around her protectively. Heart hammering in her chest at the close call, Giselle quickly nodded. Why yeah, thanks. Hurrying to their feet, both of them ran over to where the others were now standing at the edge of the cliff, looking up at the still unknown Pokémon as it thrashed about wildly. What's causing this? Giselle yelled over the sound of the titanic Pokémon's keening cries and the roiling ocean churned up by its ballistic movement. Brock suddenly pointed up at the shadowy creature a few seconds later and exclaimed, "Everyone look." Looking closer, they indeed saw a small, speeding projectile making contact with the panicking creature and exploding against its massive form. "Someone's shooting at it," Bill exclaimed in a tone of indignant disgust. "Someone is what?" Misty replied angrily. "Who?" Giselle demanded as she began looking around the dark cliffside. Brock pointed again, his squinty eyes no less sharp. "Down there near the lower cliffs." They all looked down and there saw James, rocket launcher on his shoulder, emptying the cannon of its rounds. Jesse and Meowth were right beside him, cheering their teammate on in his heartless and begrudging act. "That's who it is," Bill exclaimed in sheer outrage, proving that even a man as refined as himself could become rightly incensed given the proper motivation. Ash stared down at Team Rocket with pure, unmistakable hatred and fury burning in his amber eyes. He felt a terribly horrible bloodlust rising up inside of him as he watched the worthless trio of criminals ruthlessly assault an innocent Pokémon who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. He felt his blood begin to boil, as if it were on fire. His vision started to haze over and his eyes began to glow in the likeness of electric blue flames. He felt raw, unstoppable power flooding into every cell of his body as a shroud of dark blue energy began shrouding his body. The enraged boy crouched down and felt an overwhelming, primal urge well up inside of him to destroy that which was causing the tormented creature so much turmoil. Suddenly, he shot straight back up and threw his arms out to the side, the energy shroud blazing violently around him. His friends and Bill, wide-eyed in shock and fear, backed away from him while he arched his spine and roared in a voice that was both his and not his. Booming like thunder itself and somehow louder than the commotion being carried on around them. Team Rocket. The energy encasing his body exploded out of him like an electrode using self-destruct. The blast was so powerful it knocked his friends, Bill and Pikachu, who had thankfully leapt from his trainer's shoulder after spotting Team Rocket, off their feet and onto the ground. Even the grass where he stood had been completely burned away by the electric blue fire blazing around him. Ash then put his hands together, almost as though moving on sheer instinct, and a bright white sphere of energy began forming in the space between them. As the strange orb of glowing energy grew in his hands, vibrating as though it were alive, he bellowed down to the rocket trio in a tone that sent uncontrollable tremors of fear down the spines of all who heard it. "I have had enough of you. This ends here. Gah." Jesse, James and Meowth looked up toward the top of the cliff when they heard his shout. And when they laid their eyes upon his brightly blazing form, the dark blue aura twisting and spinning around him and the white sphere of energy forming between his hands, a feeling of utter terror gripped their hearts. "Is that the T-twerp?" Jessie's voice trembled with the fear she felt at the horrifying sight. James immediately dropped the rocket launcher on his shoulder, causing it to fall far below into one of the jagged rocks jutting up from the water, where it also exploded immediately on impact. "I think so. And he doesn't look very happy," the blue-haired man replied in a panicked tone as he desperately tried to start scaling up the wall again. Meowth's fur was standing on end, almost as though he could feel the menacing danger and imminent threat of annihilation looming over them. "We need to get out of here yous two, right now." In the terror for their own lives, the three of them tried scurrying up the cliffside. Unfortunately, the mad thrashing of the creature they had been shooting at made that endeavor just as dangerous as staying where they were. Both because of its swinging tail and the huge waves that were being repeatedly tossed against the rocky cliffs. "This is it. Your time has come." Ash raised the now fully formed energy sphere above his head, leaning back as he prepared to launch it. "Now you will PAAAAY." However, just before he could release the otherworldly blast of raw power that would have doubtlessly eliminated all three rockets at once, he suddenly felt a tug on his arm. Looking back with rage burning in his eyes, he saw Giselle standing behind him holding onto his arm. A look of true fright on her face. Please Ash, stop this. You're scaring us. You're scaring me. Similar to water being doused on a fire, as soon as he heard those words it was like a hammer smashing through a glass door. It was like her words were the soothing melody to a rampaging beast and they pierced down deep into his soul. All the way down into where the real Ash was being overshadowed by whatever powerful presence was controlling him. As his sense of self slowly began to return back to him, the energy shroud around his body also started to dissipate in kind. His eyes ceased glowing as well and the sphere of bright light between his hands eventually vanished altogether. Giselle reached out and embraced him tightly, heedless of the burning and slight feelings of electrocution she experienced from touching him since the energy itself had not yet fully disappeared. While holding him to her chest, she rested her cheek against one of his own marked ones and felt tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. Please Ash, please just calm down. Calm down, it's all okay, just please come back to us. As she held onto him tightly and whispered comforting, pleading words into his ear, Ash finally came back to himself. His eyes fully returned to normal and the crackling blue glow around his body at last faded away. With a heavy groan he sagged against her, his breathing deep and slow as he shook from the fatigue that the recent episode had rendered upon him.